Dawn broke across the Pacific on June 11, 1944. Task Force 58 was cutting through open water headed for the Marianas, and aboard the flagship USS Lexington, Vice Admiral Mark Andrew Mitchell stood on the signal bridge receiving his operational orders. The radio crackled with encrypted transmissions converting into tactical directives. Operation Forager was commencing. The orders were clear: proceed to the Mariana Islands, seize air superiority over Japanese positions at Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, and keep the fleet ready for enemy carrier response. Mitchell lowered his binoculars and turned to address his operations officer. What he commanded was staggering in its scale: 15 fleet carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, 69 destroyers. This assembled force represented the largest concentration of naval aviation power the world had ever witnessed. Yet neither Mitchell nor his officers could have fully grasped what was about to unfold. This single operation would become the most catastrophic carrier battle in naval history, a confrontation that would effectively erase Japanese naval aviation from existence. The Pacific War had already taught American military planners a fundamental lesson. Aircraft carriers were no longer just mobile airfields. They had become the decisive weapons of modern naval warfare. Control the skies, and you controlled the seas. Control the seas, and you could project military power across the vast Pacific distances that had once made Japan seem unreachable and secure. The Essex-class carriers embodied America's industrial response to this new strategic reality. Task Force 58 pushed through Pacific swells at 25 knots. Each Essex-class carrier displaced 27,100 tons of seawater and stretched 872 feet in length with a beam of 93 feet. Mitchell stood on the flag bridge, observing formations that spread across 40 miles of open ocean. His command included 7 Essex-class carriers: Essex, Yorktown, Hornet, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Lexington, and Enterprise. 8 Independence-class light carriers completed his carrier strength: Bellwood, Bataan, Monterey, Cabot, San Jacinto, Princeton, Langley, and Cowpens. Each Essex-class carrier housed 3,448 men and an air group of 90 aircraft organized into 4 squadrons. The complement included 36 F-6F Hellcat fighters, 36 SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, and 18 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. The mathematics of carrier warfare possessed an elegant simplicity. 900 aircraft operating from mobile platforms capable of positioning themselves anywhere across the Pacific. Each carrier possessed 4 elevators that could cycle aircraft between the hangar deck and flight deck in 45 seconds. The flight deck catapults could launch an aircraft every 30 seconds during surge operations. Captain Arleigh Burke, Mitchell's chief of staff, had calculated every tactical implication with characteristic precision. Burke was a Harvard Law School graduate turned naval strategist who understood that carrier warfare ultimately boiled down to equations of time and space: launch cycles, recovery windows, fuel consumption rates, ammunition expenditure. Victory or defeat often hinged on minutes in launch timing and nautical miles in positioning. Aboard the Japanese carrier Taiho, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa was reviewing his operational orders for Operation AGO. Taiho was the newest and largest carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy, displacing 29,300 tons and carrying 75 aircraft. Her armored flight deck, unique among Japanese carriers, had been designed to withstand 500-pound bomb hits. Ozawa commanded 9 carriers carrying 430 aircraft, Japan's last concentrated carrier striking force. The first mobile fleet included veterans Shokaku and Zuikaku, both survivors of Pearl Harbor, along with fleet carriers Junyo and Heiho, and light carriers Ryuho, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho. But the numbers masked a fatal weakness that had been destroying Japanese carrier operations since mid-1944. Pilot quality had deteriorated catastrophically. Pearl Harbor veterans had averaged 700 flight hours. Ozawa's pilots averaged fewer than 275 hours. Some possessed as little as 100 hours total flight time. The mathematics of attrition had decimated Japanese naval aviation as decisively as any weapon could. The Imperial Navy had lost over 400 experienced pilots at Midway, another 250 at the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, and hundreds more during the grinding Solomon Islands campaign. The American carriers formed into 4 task groups as they approached the Marianas on June 11th. Task Group 58.1 under Rear Admiral Joseph "Joko" Clark included Hornet, Yorktown, Bellwood, and Bataan. Task Group 58.2, commanded by Rear Admiral Alfred Montgomery, carried Bunker Hill, Wasp, Monterey, and Cabot. Task Group 58.3, led by Rear Admiral John Reeves, featured Enterprise, Lexington, San Jacinto, and Princeton. Task Group 58.4, under Rear Admiral William Harrell, commanded Essex, Langley, and Cowpens. At 1:30 hours on June 11th, the first fighter sweep launched from the Essex-class carriers against Japanese airfields in the Marianas. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer, commanding VF-15 from USS Essex, led 32 Hellcats toward the Chipan Azulito airfield. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat represented everything the Essex-class carriers embodied: superiority achieved through industrial mass production. Powered by a 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, the Hellcat could reach 380 miles per hour and climb to 20,000 feet in 7 minutes. Radar operator First Class James Chen, aboard USS Essex, tracked the fighter sweep on his SK air search radar. The system could detect aircraft at ranges up to 100 miles and altitudes reaching 30,000 feet. Chen swept the scope every few degrees, analyzing each return signal, calculating range, and bearing with methodical precision. The Marianas' air defense consisted of approximately 500 Japanese aircraft, though only half remained operational. At 13:35, Brewer's Hellcats encountered the first Japanese defenders. 30 Mitsubishi A6M-0s rose to intercept, but the engagement proved brutally one-sided. The Zero had been revolutionary in 1940, yet by June 1944 it was catastrophically obsolete. Maximum speed stood at 331 miles per hour. Climb rate to 20,000 feet required 9.5 minutes. The aircraft offered no armor protection for pilots and featured no self-sealing fuel tanks. Most critically, the Japanese pilots averaged less than 200 flight hours, with many having fewer than 100 hours total. The first day's combat over the Marianas destroyed 147 Japanese aircraft against 11 American losses. Commander David McCampbell, commanding Air Group 15 from Essex, would later describe the engagement as clubbing baby seals. The Japanese pilots flew predictable patterns, failed to maintain formation integrity, and exhibited poor gunnery skills. Their tactical communications were confused and contradictory. Japanese naval intelligence monitoring American radio traffic from Tawi-Tawi began comprehending the magnitude of the threat developing. Emergency messages dispatched to Admiral Ozawa ordered the mobile fleet to sortie immediately for what they believed would be the decisive battle. Operation AGO was activated. The plan required land-based aircraft from the Marianas to attack and damage American carriers, allowing Ozawa's carrier aircraft to deliver the killing blow. On June 13th, cryptanalysts at Fleet Radio Unit Pacific intercepted and decoded Japanese message traffic, revealing Ozawa's intentions. The mobile fleet would sortie from Tawi-Tawi, refuel in the Philippine Sea, then attack the American invasion force at Saipan. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding 5th Fleet, made the critical decision that would shape the impending battle. Rather than pursuing the Japanese fleet, Task Force 58 would remain tied to the invasion beaches, forcing Ozawa to attack them. Executive Officer John Williamson aboard USS Yorktown calculated the tactical geometry. Japanese carrier aircraft possessed longer range than American equivalents. Zeros could fly 1,940 miles on internal fuel. Kates and Vals possessed similar endurance. American Hellcats had a combat radius of 340 miles. Helldivers 276 miles. Avengers 275 miles. This meant Ozawa could launch strikes from beyond American striking range, a critical tactical advantage. But Williamson understood what the Japanese had apparently forgotten. Modern carrier warfare was not about individual aircraft performance, but integrated system capabilities. Radar-directed fighter control, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, damage control procedures, Communications discipline. The Essex-class carriers possessed overwhelming advantages in every single category except aircraft range. At 21:30 on June 18th, submarine USS Kavala detected the Japanese mobile fleet 360 miles west-southwest of Saipan. Lieutenant Commander Herman Kostler tracked the enemy formation for 6 hours, transmitting contact reports that reached Spruance by 3 in the morning on June 19th. The Japanese were approaching from the west, apparently unaware their position was known. Dawn on June 19, 1944, brought ideal carrier operations conditions. Visibility extended 40 miles in perfect clarity. Moderate easterly trade winds blew at 14 knots. Sea State 3 produced long Pacific swells without interference. Perfect flying weather for what would become the largest carrier battle in history. At 7:30, radar operators aboard USS Yorktown detected the first Japanese strike wave at 140 miles range. 69 aircraft approached from the west at 18,000 feet. Fighter Direction Officer Lieutenant Joseph Eggert began vectoring combat air patrol fighters to intercept. The new Grumman F-6F-3 Hellcats, armed with 6.5 caliber machine guns carrying 400 rounds per gun, climbed toward the incoming raid. Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu, flying from USS Lexington, was among the first to engage. An ace with 12 previous victories, Vrasiu would later describe the interception with astonishment. He couldn't believe it. They were flying in perfect formation like it was an air show. No weaving, no cover, just straight and level flight. In 8 minutes of combat, Vrasiu shot down 6 Japanese aircraft, becoming an ace in a single day. The Japanese strike leader, Lieutenant Commander Akira Tarui from carrier Taiho, had never faced radar-directed fighter interception. His pilots, averaging 150 flight hours, proved unprepared for coordinated Hellcat attacks. American fighters engaged from above and behind, using superior speed and firepower to devastating effect. Of 69 aircraft in the first wave, 42 were shot down before reaching the American fleet. At 9:10, submarine USS Albacore fired 6 torpedoes at carrier Taiho from 5,000 yards. One torpedo struck the carrier's aviation fuel system, causing vapor leaks that would prove ultimately fatal. Damage Control Officer Commander Utaka Kobayashi ordered ventilation systems reversed to clear the fumes, inadvertently spreading aviation gasoline vapors throughout the ship. The second Japanese strike wave, 128 aircraft strong, arrived at 1000 hours. Radar-directed Hellcats intercepted at 60 miles from the fleet. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer, leading VF-15 from Essex, described the engagement with stark simplicity. It was like a training exercise. They flew straight into the guns without taking evasive action. His wingman asked if they were really in combat. 97 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in the second wave. American anti-aircraft fire, directed by Mark 37 gun directors with radar ranging, created an impenetrable wall of steel around the carriers. The new proximity-fused shells detonated within lethal range of aircraft without requiring direct hits. Japanese pilots who survived would report that American ships seemed surrounded by an absolutely impenetrable shield of explosions. At 12:20, submarine USS Kavala put 4 torpedoes into veteran carrier Shokaku. Captain Hiroshi Matsubara ordered counter-flooding, but the damage proved catastrophic. Shokaku had survived Coral Sea and Eastern Solomons, but 9 months of constant operations without proper maintenance had weakened her damage control capabilities. Aviation fuel leaked from ruptured tanks. Electrical systems failed. 3 hours later, Shokaku sank with 1,263 men aboard. The third Japanese wave of 47 aircraft, launched at 1000, reached the American fleet at 1300. Only 7 returned to their carriers. Fighter pilot Ensign Kanayoshi Muto, one of the few survivors, would later testify about the overwhelming experience. The American fighters were everywhere, above, beside, behind. Their tactics were perfect. They never had a chance. Admiral Ozawa, unaware of his mounting losses, ordered a 4th strike of 82 aircraft at 11:30. Confused by poor communications and navigation errors, this wave split into 2 groups. One group of 33 aircraft flew north and found nothing. The other 49 aircraft encountered Task Group 58.2. The Hellcat fighters tore through the Japanese formation with devastating precision. 30 enemy aircraft fell from the sky in just 12 minutes. Then, at 14:52 hours, the carrier Taiho erupted in a catastrophic detonation that seemed to split the ship in half. The accumulated vapors from ruptured aviation fuel tanks had reached a critical threshold. The explosion was so violent it broke the carrier's back. She plunged beneath the waves, taking 1,650 men down with her, including Admiral Ozawa's entire air staff. Ozawa himself managed to escape the inferno, relocating his command flag to the cruiser Haguro, but the coordinated control of the Japanese mobile fleet had effectively dissolved. When sunset arrived on June 19th, the Japanese had sent forth 373 carrier aircraft into battle. Only 130 made it back. American air losses came to 29 fighters shot down in direct combat, yet most of those pilots were recovered alive. The exchange ratio shattered all previous records, exceeding 10-1. This represented the most lopsided aerial engagement of the entire war. The American pilots, who averaged somewhere between 300 and 500 hours of flying time, had methodically dismantled their adversaries through superior training and tactics. The following morning brought a critical discovery. Search planes launched from the USS Enterprise spotted the retreating Japanese fleet at 15:40 on June 20th. The enemy ships were positioned 275 miles to the west-northwest of Task Force 58. It was an extreme distance, far beyond the normal range that American carrier aircraft could cover and still return safely. Recovery operations would have to happen after nightfall, something that naval aviation doctrine considered extraordinarily risky. Admiral Mark Mitcher recognized that this opportunity might never come again. He made his decision without hesitation. At 16:21 hours, he issued the command that would become legendary in carrier aviation history. Launch everything you've got. 240 aircraft shot into the air in a remarkable 10 minutes, launching from 11 different carriers. The strike force included 85 Hellcats, 77 dive bombers, and 54 torpedo bombers. Every pilot knew the mathematics of this mission with absolute certainty. They possessed just enough fuel to reach the target, conduct the attack, and return to the task force. There was no margin for error whatsoever, no reserves for detours or delays. Lieutenant Commander James Ramage, who led Bombing Squadron 10 from the Enterprise, gathered his pilots before they launched and spoke words they would never forget. "Gentlemen, this is a one-way ticket unless you watch your fuel religiously. Lean mixture settings, optimal engine configurations, absolutely no wasted maneuvering. We get one pass at the target, then we point ourselves homeward and don't deviate." As twilight descended over the Philippine Sea, the American strike force located the Japanese fleet. The old carrier Hio, once a passenger liner before being converted to naval service, took multiple devastating torpedo hits from Avengers from the air group below. Her internal compartments lacked the subdivision necessary to contain progressive flooding. She sank in approximately 2 hours, carrying 250 sailors to the bottom. The carriers Zuikaku and Chiyoda both suffered considerable damage, and the battleship Haruna was also hit. The return journey became an extraordinary test of navigation skill and pilot endurance. As complete darkness enveloped the Pacific, fuel gauges dropped steadily lower. Aircraft began running dry. Some pilots ditched beside destroyers when their engines simply stopped. Others managed to reach the general vicinity of the task force, but found themselves unable to locate their own carriers in the absolute darkness. At 20:45 hours, Mitcher made a decision that would pass into naval legend: turn on the lights. Every ship in the entire task force suddenly illuminated. Searchlights pointed straight up into the night sky. Navigation lights blazed across the water. Flight deck lights outlined landing strips brilliantly. Illumination shells burst overhead, turning darkness into artificial day. For 2 straight hours, the fleet worked feverishly to recover aircraft, many pilots landing on whichever carrier they happened to reach. 80 aircraft were lost, but the majority of their pilots were rescued from the water. The operation had extracted a heavy price from American carrier aviation, Yet Japanese carrier power had been effectively terminated. By morning on June 21st, the full scope of the Japanese disaster became apparent. Over 2 days of intense combat, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 3 fleet carriers: the Taiho, the Shokaku, and the Hio. More significantly, they had lost somewhere between 476 and 600 aircraft overall, counting both carrier-based planes and land-based fighters, along with approximately 445 highly trained aviators. The pilots who did manage to return to Ozawa's remaining carriers carried neither the skills nor the combat experience necessary for offensive operations. American losses totaled 123 aircraft, with 76 pilots killed. Yet Task Force 58 still maintained over 750 operational aircraft, with experienced pilots at the controls. The industrial calculus was relentless and unforgiving. The American training pipeline was producing 2,000 new naval aviators monthly. Each recruit completed 500 hours of comprehensive flight training, including 50 hours specifically in combat aircraft types. The curriculum incorporated radar-guided interception, nocturnal flying, and sophisticated instrument approaches. Japanese pilot training had collapsed dramatically to somewhere between 100 and 150 hours total. Many barely qualified pilots received only 50 hours in actual combat aircraft. Fuel shortages meant training flights were minimal and infrequent. The most experienced instructors had been pulled from training squadrons and sent back to active fighting units. The accelerated programs that remained produced pilots with barely adequate takeoff and landing skills, let alone the sophisticated aerial maneuvering required in actual combat. Commander David McCampbell, destined to become the Navy's highest-scoring ace with 34 confirmed kills, recognized the tactical shift immediately. By June 1944, we weren't facing the same Japanese Navy that struck Pearl Harbor. Those pilots were gone, killed in earlier battles. Now we were fighting teenagers who had barely learned to fly. The Essex-class carriers and their accompanying air groups represented a weapons system designed for large-scale industrial warfare, and Japan simply lacked the capacity to compete. Technical analysis demonstrated the remarkable effectiveness of American carrier operations. Each Essex-class carrier could launch a complete strike package of 40 aircraft in 12 minutes flat. Getting those aircraft back aboard required 18 minutes. Rearming each plane and refueling the tanks consumed 45 minutes. Theoretically, each carrier could generate 3 full strikes within a 4-hour window. When 15 carriers operated in perfect coordination, Task Force 58 could put 600 aircraft over a single target at the same moment. The Philippine Sea engagement shattered Japanese naval aviation with finality. Admiral Sumu Toyoda conducted a grim assessment of what had transpired. The first mobile fleet is now rendered completely ineffective as an offensive force. Our carrier aviation strength has been completely exhausted. We must transition to fundamentally different approaches. Those alternative approaches materialized 4 months later, manifesting as kamikaze suicide attacks. They represented the final resort of a navy that could no longer produce trained conventional pilots. Ozawa himself, rescued from the water after the Taiho went down, submitted his comprehensive report on June 24th. The accuracy of their radar-guided interception proved absolutely perfect. The enemy pilots displayed such overwhelming superiority in every dimension of aerial combat. Our strikes were neutralized before achieving effective weapons range. The mobile fleet's aviation units have been completely eliminated as a functional combat force. The Essex-class carriers had proven the American philosophy of naval warfare through sheer mass production capacity. Every ship incorporated improvements derived from hard-won combat lessons. Redesigned ventilation systems now prevented explosive vapor accumulation. Comprehensive damage control protocols and intensive crew training meant that severely wounded ships, including the USS Franklin and USS Bunker Hill, would endure assaults that would have sent earlier generation carriers to the bottom. Production numbers made Japanese hopes for success mathematically impossible. By June 1944, American shipyards had already completed 7 Essex-class carriers, with 17 additional ships still under construction. The Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company independently was launching one carrier every 6 months. Through standardized construction methods and assembly line manufacturing, completion time had dropped to just 14 months. American technological advantages were equally overwhelming. Radar systems could detect targets at 100 miles distance and calculate altitude precisely. The Mark 37 gun director, when paired with Mark 12 radar, could track aircraft at 40,000 yards. VT proximity fuses boosted anti-aircraft effectiveness by 300%. Combat information centers orchestrated defensive operations with unparalleled coordination. Japanese technology remained frozen at 1941 standards. The Zero fighter, once revolutionary at war's outbreak, had received only incremental enhancements. Radar equipment was crude and frequently malfunctioned. Communication systems had become obsolete. Most significantly, the Japanese industrial base simply could not redesign and rebuild entire systems based on combat experience. The training apparatus highlighted the fundamental strategic divergence. The American Naval Aviation Training Command operated 14 air stations housing 10,000 training aircraft. Monthly pilot production exceeded combat losses threefold. Each aviator progressed methodically through primary flight training, basic courses, advanced instruction, and operational qualification. Battle-hardened veterans rotated back home to become instructors, guaranteeing that hard-learned tactical lessons entered the curriculum immediately. Japanese training had degenerated into compressed courses, producing marginal pilots. The prestigious Yokosuka program, which had previously developed elite naval aviators before 1942, was reduced to teaching rudimentary flying. Advanced combat training disappeared entirely due to fuel rationing. Formation flying was minimal. Gunnery practice was rare. Navigation training barely existed. The human toll proved catastrophic. 450 Japanese aircrew perished in Philippine sea waters, and most represented irreplaceable combat veterans with over 1 year of operational experience. Their deaths meant that entire generations of institutional knowledge regarding carrier warfare vanished permanently. Survivors simply lacked the background to instruct newcomers or devise innovative tactics. American personnel management ensured experience persisted across the organization. Combat tours were restricted to preserve skilled aviators. Assignment rotations guaranteed every squadron contained experienced pilots alongside junior pilots. Veteran aviators were systematically assigned to training commands upon completing their combat rotations. This methodical attention to human resources management proved as critical as technological superiority. By October 1944, when the Imperial Japanese Navy launched its ultimate offensive at Leyte Gulf, the carrier force that had shocked the world at Pearl Harbor existed only in memory. Admiral Ozawa led 4 carriers southward with merely 108 aircraft aboard, many crewed by half-trained pilots. The resulting engagement off Cape Engano resembled execution rather than battle. American carrier aircraft sank all 4 Japanese carriers while sustaining only 10 losses. The Essex-class carriers persisted through the remainder of the Pacific conflict, but their greatest triumph had already occurred. Within 2 days traversing the Philippine Sea, they had accomplished what 3 years of steady attrition had not achieved: the complete elimination of Japanese naval aviation as a viable combat instrument. Admiral Chester Nimitz offered his characteristically modest assessment. The Essex-class carriers and their air groups symbolized American industrial democracy conducting war. Mass production combined with technological advancement and rigorous training created a weapons system the Japanese could neither match nor overcome. The Philippine Sea battle transcended mere tactical success. It vindicated the entire American approach to contemporary warfare. That legacy extended well beyond the Second World War. 24 Essex-class carriers reached completion, continuing operations throughout Korea, Vietnam, and into the 1970s. The USS Lexington, which survived the Philippine Sea engagement, remained active through 1991, standing testament to the enduring design that transformed naval warfare fundamentally. In Pacific depths, 3 Japanese carriers rest eternally, their aircraft preserved within hangars, their crews remaining at stations. They symbolize that final moment when human capability and sacrifice might have transcended industrial capacity. Yet mathematics, as one executive officer had grasped, permitted no exceptions. The Essex-class carriers had accomplished something beyond a single victory. They demonstrated that contemporary naval warfare belonged exclusively to industrial democracies capable of marshalling technological sophistication, scientific training, and mass production simultaneously. The Philippine Sea marked when naval aviation transitioned from an elite craft into an industrial process. Victory would henceforth depend not upon individual heroism, but production figures, training hours, and technical specifications. The Essex-class carriers, built within American factories and manned by citizen sailors, had permanently altered naval warfare forever.